Today's workshop is the Vermont Graduation Readiness Tool. I'm excited to introduce you to John Spinney, the Postsecondary Transition Coordinator at the Vermont Agency of Education. John is in his 20th year at the Vermont Agency of Education, where he works to support systems that promote good transitions to post-school life for students with disabilities statewide. John's two youngest brothers were adopted as infants and both have Down syndrome. John grew up being immersed in the disability world and is now the legal guardian for his two brothers who are now in their 40s. Thank you for joining us today.
All right. Thanks, Karen. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So thanks for coming, folks. We're going to get going with talking through what this is, the Vermont Graduation Readiness Tool. This is a very Vermont-specific thing. Meanwhile, most of you probably know that when it comes to special education, it's federal, it's, nationwide. But today we're going to be talking about something that we created here in our state with our interagency system. And it's very Vermont specific. And this system and this tool is really designed to support the IEP team with especially, an understanding that parents are experts on their students, their son or daughters, and are a critical aspect of that IEP team. So, and if you have questions, I want to make sure I address all the questions. If it's something urgent, maybe you could chime in, but otherwise put it in the chat and we will try to get to those questions at the end and have some discussion time as well. So, all right. I'm just going to move my little thing so I can see better. All right. So as far as this background on why we did this, so historically, we were in this situation where sometimes students with intensive needs were graduating too soon, and some were kind of graduating too late. And it was kind of all over the map statewide. And this is back in the 2016-ish era. And we knew, when I say we, I'm sort of referring to our kind of interagency system where we have AOE, we have vocational rehabilitation, that's voc rehab, which is now called higher ability. So we had higher ability. Back then it was just, we called it VR. And we had AOE and we had developmental services. I'm trying to think of other entities that might have been involved at that time, but those were the primary ones. And we wanted to try to problem solve this issue where some kids were graduating too soon and some were too late. And so we created the graduation readiness tool back then. And it's this basically a tool for an IEP team to kind of look at these different components and determine, is the student ready for graduation? Because for a student with intensive needs who is on an IEP, if the IEP team determines that, they need to stay longer than their typical cohort, and by that I mean, their peers. And sometimes our students with intensive needs stay a little bit longer than their peers. And that's to help them get the skills they need, right? And so we just needed a better system because sometimes high schools were not always acknowledging that need for the student to have more time. And then there were other scenarios where there was sort of a culture where that high school had kind of developed a culture where, if a student had a developmental disability, they would just stay until they're 22. And so kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. Meanwhile, it was all over the map statewide. So some too soon, some too late. And we needed something to problem solve this. And so a lot of work went into this back in 2016 and 17. We created the first version of the tool. And then for the last, 5-6 years or so, we've been collecting feedback, and we wanted to make an update, and we updated and released a new tool in December of 2024. And we're going to go through each item today to help you understand, you know, how to use this. And there's also a bit of a mindset shift that I want to touch base on with the parents here too. So using the tool is designed to quantify something that is historically hard to quantify, and that is the access to transition services. And by getting a better understanding of how much access that student has had, it helps the IEP team better determine an appropriate graduation date so that it's individualized to that student. So it's not too soon and it's not too late. It's just right. It's just for that student. And along the way, as part of this, you have those connections made with adult services. It's all intertwined here, and we'll get into that as well. So I sort of put quotes around C because as you, as a team, as you're using the tool and you're looking at access across all these different components that we're going to talk about, you start to get a sense of, well, this kid has not had access to all these different things. Why would we expect him to graduate this June? Let's say that's one scenario, right? Whereas you might have another student that, they've been doing the tool since ninth grade, and the student is now maybe already had 1 or 2 extra years of high school, and they have realized, look, our student has had all this access, and we're really developing our connection with the adult services agency to have a smooth transition. And we're going to plan for a graduation this coming June per se. Those kinds of discussions might come out of the ongoing use of the tool. The tool is not intended to just create this like overall score. Hey, if you hit this score, you're ready to graduate. Don't think of it like that. It's more about, okay, well, our student has had really good access across many of these items, but we can clearly see they have not had access to these other items. And so let's factor that into our decision about how we're going to determine the timing for graduation. So this is sort of a slide to address kind of the parent mindset. So, rather than having an expectation that a student who has a developmental disability stays until they're 22, we want to change that mindset to looking at the access to transition services and supports. It's the access that we want to make decisions based on, not age. So the readiness tool, the graduation readiness tool, helps the IEP team see how much access a student has had prior to graduation. It's a more individualized approach than just a blanket approach where the student stays in high school until 22, even if they have had all that access to transition. So the new tool, we've collected feedback over the years from lots of folks, including the Vermont Council of Special Ed Administrators, the Vermont Family Network, Vermont Department of Health, Children with Special Health Care Needs, as well as some of my AOE colleagues over the years looking at the different items that were on the tool and a desire to improve the tool. And so we're going to click on the new version of the tool. Now, a lot of this language at the top is something that we just basically discussed, but I'll sort of skim through it a bit. I mean, and this is kind of a key statement, this opening part, especially for high schools to remember, because this tool is really designed for the whole IEP team, right? So it's for the schools, it's for the parents, it's for the students. Graduation for a student on an IEP is not just about meeting those local graduation requirements. The student must also be offered reasonable and appropriate access to transition services. Emphasis on the access. So, historically, we may have seen a high school that, has a student with intensive needs, and they, maybe they were using a credit bearing system, And so they had a multi-year plan where the student was getting some alternative credit to graduate and maybe met those credit requirements, but has not had all that access to transition, and perhaps was pushed to graduate too soon. So this tool is designed to kind of prevent that from happening, as well as also being able to recognize, hey, our student is ready. We've really, the student has had access to all these different things and they're ready to graduate. So anyway, let's kind of move through this. Now, if you were familiar with the first version of the tool, it was really focused on graduation readiness points. And we shifted that. We pivoted away from that to access points because that's really the emphasis of the tool. We wanted to improve the tool. The tool is all about the access. It's not necessary, it was a little confusing, I think, for some folks with the old tool trying to determine readiness based on the components. So we shifted it to access so that it's very clear. And so each IEP team member can look at these different components and put a number there for how much access the student has had. So 0 would mean little or no access, while 2 would mean consistent access. For student engagement, 0 would mean not engaged and 2 would mean very engaged. And some sections may not be applicable for a student for that given year. Now, we are recommending now statewide to all the high schools that IEP teams start using this in ninth grade. And then at each annual IEP meeting, they would review it, and just sort of forecast and look ahead to the different things that are going to be coming down the pipeline that the student should have access to. So there's a little bit of an access point key here. And then let's touch on some of these questions real quick. And then we'll go into the tool, which is below this. So these are some questions for the IEP team as you're using this tool. So let's say you have a freshman and it's the IEP meeting and you're going through this tool as a team. In what areas is the student on track for graduation? Does the IEP transition plan? Now, if it's a freshman, they might not yet have a transition plan, but more and more high schools are starting to do transition plans in ninth grade, even if that's before the requirement. And we're encouraging of that. And hopefully at some point, our state, when we update our regulations for special ed, we're going to change the age from 16 to 14 for the IEP transition plan. Some states have already done that, and we want to join those states in that because we recognize that transition planning can be very complicated, especially for students with multiple disabilities and differing needs. So, but for an IEP team that has a student that is already on a transition plan, this bullet number 2 is like relevant. Does the plan provide for the development of key transition skills that the student needs? It's all about the skills. And these are the skills the student needs to meet those post-secondary goals/outcomes. And if your son or daughter has a transition plan, maybe you're somewhat familiar with this. And on the transition plan, you have these post-secondary goals that are these things that the student is going to do after they graduate. Like they will be enrolled in a training program at their developmental services agency or something like that, or they will be employed 20 hours a week, or whatever that outcome is. The IEP team then has to say, okay, here's the outcome. Now, what are the skills that student needs to meet those outcomes? And when that student transitions to adult services, we want to have that student have those skills. Has the student had reasonable and appropriate access to skill building transition services? For those transition skills that the IEP team has identified as key areas, the team should discuss and forecast what level of skill the student needs to reach by the time they transition to adult services, developmental services, and then build year by year into that so the student is getting those skills before they transition to adult services. What areas does the team feel are lacking, and what's the plan to address that? Does the team feel that the student is ready to graduate and exit? So these are sort of prompts and questions that the IEP team can be having each year. You don't want to just do this in that student's final year. You know what I mean? Like it's almost, it should have been started earlier so that the parents, you have time to start to think through these things. What things are coming down the pipeline? What are we doing to help our student be ready and acquire these skills? All right, so this is the tool. So this first item, the student has met or will meet the local graduation requirements. And so basically that's saying that they're going to meet the proficiencies required for graduation if the high school is using proficiencies, or if they're still using credits, that the student is going to meet the credit requirements. Now, if the student has some significant needs, they may be a student that has historically been on a multi-year plan if the school was using credits, and that's where it's like an alternative credit accrual plan due to the nature of the student's disability. But if the high school is not using credits and they've pivoted to proficiencies, there may be a need to do the access plan, and that is a link to some more information on that. And the tricky thing with that is that there are, it's one of these things that there's no monitoring per se from AOE on this initiative where, like I said, some schools are still using credits, but they were supposed to pivot to proficiencies back in 2020. And of course, we had COVID and that probably changed some things, but I did a recent training on this, and there is some more resources around this if you'd like to get some more info. But long story short, for the high schools that have pivoted to using proficiencies to determine graduation, some of the high schools have taken the AOE's guidance. We have a whole nother team that I'm not on. It's that covers all the content areas and the proficiency work. And the recommendation from AOE to high schools is to use a proficiency scale. It's like a rubric. And if a high school is using those proficiency scales, there's really no need for an access plan in the traditional sense because the IEP team can identify the entry point in a very clear way how to determine if this kid's going to meet the graduation requirements because it has these different access points. The graduation requirement has been scaffolded down essentially. So there's different entry points into meeting that. It's a big topic area. I know it's a lot for probably this training, but we do have more resources on that, and folks are always welcome to reach out to me. But I did do a recorded training on this. It's up on our AOE website. The next component, the student has an attendance rate that meets the graduation requirements of the school. Now, remember, for each of these components, the team would be giving some access points for. So if the student has been accessing those graduation requirements and it either through the multi-year plan or through a proficiency scales or through the actual PBGR proficiency-based graduation access plan, then you can kind of give an access point for how much, based on what you think in terms of their access to that. Now, if the high school has not done any of that work and the graduation requirements are not accessible for your student at all, then it would be a 0, right? Like, so the team needs to look into this and figure out, well, what are we going to do so our student can access the graduation requirements? Next up, the student has developed the transition skills needed to meet the post-secondary goals. This is like one of the most critical aspects of this tool, as well as the actual transition plan in the IEP. It's all about those skills. If that transition plan is not building those skills that the student needs to meet those post-secondary outcomes, then the plan needs to be looked at and modified and updated and worked with. And We have more and more special educators that are becoming much more proficient in this work, and they have access to lots of resources and supports. So it's been nice to see, because keep in mind, I'm obviously at the Agency of Education. I'm sort of on a team that is kind of like quality control system for the special ed system in Vermont schools. And so those schools get monitored on different cycles. And if they are showing problems with their transition plans, that's where I get involved. And I'm sort of a coach in a sense, working with those special educators and the special ed directors on improving their transition plans. And just like I said to you, I say the same thing to them. It's all about the skills. Do they have the skills to meet those post-secondary goals? And that's where those annual goals in the transition plan come in. So, you have an annual goal on the transition plan for education and training, you have an annual goal for employment, and you have an annual goal for independent living. And those are the goals that that student is working on throughout the year for that given IEP. Because remember, IEP just is for that given year. It's an annual thing, and then it's going to get renewed the following year. The post-secondary outcomes are a little bit different because they take place after graduation. So the team is always updating those annual goals. They're reviewing those outcomes. Are they still totally relevant for this student? And reviewing and updating other aspects of the plan, but with special emphasis on those annual goals, addressing the skills. And those goals need to be measurable and follow a SMART goal format. So that's a lot of the work I do with those high schools if they got flagged in our monitoring system. So this next one kind of just gets at a lot of what I was just talking about. This link would bring you to a huge resource that we spent quite a bit of time creating. And that is a resource for high school special educators and making sure that they understand the intent and the rationale and the implementation of a good IEP transition plan. Now, I keep talking about skills. Just to give it a little more clarity, here's some examples of the kinds of skills I'm talking about. Communication skills, self-advocacy skills, executive functioning skills, like practicing and developing their skills around being where they need to be on time, or doing whatever responsibilities and tasks that they have to do. They develop a system for keeping themselves organized, and they develop those executive functioning skills. Self-regulation skills, reading comprehension skills, or any other skills that the student needs in light of how their disability impacts their future employment, their future education and training, and their future independent living. So the IEP should provide for the development of the skills that the student will need in order to meet those post-secondary goals / outcomes. The summary of performance, this is something that is really only relevant for students who are in their last few months prior to graduating. And there's an example, if those links have an example and some guidance around this, and there's also a recorded training on it. You can think of this summary of performance as a passport for your student, your son or daughter. So if they were on an IEP, it's a requirement that they get a summary of performance prior to graduation. Now, it is something where it's a tool. It's not a tool. It's a kind of it's a report in a sense, but the student is heavily involved in the creation of it, and the student themselves needs to be involved and have input and be comfortable with everything that's written on it, because this is a report that can go to an employer if the student is okay with that. It can go to a developmental services office. It could go to a student support office at a college. And the summary of performance essentially is trying to document all these things that worked well for the student while they were in high school on an IEP. It also should touch on some of the challenges that the student had and how they were mitigated or strategies that helped that student in light of their disability. So it's kind of this passport that is issued to the student. Now, if parents have guardianship, of course, it would go to the parents, and then it's up to them how they want to use it. But typically, you know, we try to have this document be just easily interpretable by anybody. So we don't want to use education jargon, and even, we want to have a typical employer to be able to, if the student was okay with this, have the employer be able to look at it and glean some good information about things and strategies that might be helpful for that person that's now working for them. Or maybe it's a student support office at the college is looking at this and realizes some things that they can implement at the college level that might be helpful for the student. This next one is another important, these are all important ones. And we've all, we've over the years since this tool first came out, we really vetted everything. And so if a component is on here, there's lots of folks that feel it's important and it's legitimately on here for a reason. So, if the student has a paraeducator, this is a big one. The IEP team is considering ways to fade the paraeducator support in order to increase student independence. So this might be something that is just, the most relevant really in that final year of high school, or maybe the final 2 years. It's really up to the IEP team. So if your student is in ninth grade and you're reviewing this tool and the student has a para, to start to think about ways in the future that you might be able to start to fade some of that support so that the student can develop more of that independence. And what does that look like? And it should be appropriate, right? This might not be, this is a case by case, individualized thing where the IEP team considers this for each of their students. Sorry, their own individual student. And to be looking at it each year. Are there places where we can fade the para support?
So, John, I think since you're going through many different things, I'll go ahead and ask a couple of the questions because they pertain to what you just talked about. So
Sure.
there's a question about, or a statement question. It sounds like there should not be any test data, standard scores on the summary of performance.
Okay, let's touch on that. Typically, colleges will ask for that, and so they will, they can, if the student is their own guardian or the parents are the guardian, if they have consent, they can release those most recent evaluations to the college. And the feds created the summary of performance to try to circumvent or sort of problem solve this issue, because historically, before this came out, a lot of colleges were putting pressure on the high schools, and they would say, hey, high school, we want you to do a new special ed evaluation before your student comes to college. And the high school would say, well, they haven't, they're not due for they just had a reevaluation 2 years ago. They don't have, we do this every 3 years. It hasn't been, there's no reason for us to update it right now. So that the college could get the most recent evaluation. But the reason they're having all the states do the summary performance is to add all that other information that the college might need, and to kind of problem solve this issue where the colleges are putting pressure on the high schools. So they certainly can include those evaluations. It's up to the student and the parent to release those to the college. Was there anything else, Karen, on that, or was that?
Okay, that was the question about the summary of performance, but I'll go ahead and ask this other question because
Okay.
it did pertain to something you mentioned earlier. Is there any data to indicate how widely the tool is being used in high school, particularly beginning with ninth graders?
It's a really good question, and I guess the answer is not yet. So we haven't done a formal data collection specifically around this tool, but we would like to. So, especially now that we're, really recommending that IEP teams start it in ninth grade. So we don't have any data yet, but generally I hear of teams using it quite a bit around the state. I just don't have an actual percentage or number. So um, if your son or daughter is in ninth grade or higher and on an IEP and the team is not using this, I would certainly bring it up. Can we please start using this? This has been recommended as a process for Vermont IEP teams that are in high school. Okay. Um, let's keep going. And all right. If appropriate, the transition plan calls for work experiences and access to them is provided. So that might look like it could be potentially a number of things. If your high school has a work-based learning coordinator, and they help set up a work experience, a volunteer work experience, or some type of internship, some type of real world situation where the student can get some employment skills. Those are the things, like if a student is getting access to that, then, you give them the appropriate access points for that. Now, if it's not being offered and the student has not had access to that, but it's something that the student wants and needs and the parent wants it and thinks it's totally important and they haven't had access, then you would put a 0 here. And then after you've gone through this tool, that would certainly be one of the most critical discussion items. It comes back to that statement I've said about skills. And most of you may probably know this, but students with developmental disabilities typically do not generalize the skills unless they're doing it hands-on and they're doing it on their own. You can't just explain it. Some students, when you explaining how to do something, they might not fully internalize it and take it in and develop that skill unless they're like doing it themselves and they're getting out there and they're getting that work experience. They're working with some of those folks that are employed by that company or that business and the customers, and they're out there doing it and learning that skill. They've got to maybe have a job coach or a para. And it's a really important aspect to getting ready for life after high school. The Vermont Dual Enrollment Voucher Program. This is an awesome program if it's appropriate for your son or daughter. It's basically the voucher program has a free course for juniors and for seniors. And there's a link right there that talks through kind of the implications for students with disabilities who are on an IEP and how to kind of navigate that and look into that process. But I always like to bring it up because it's kind of the ultimate transition activity in a sense, because there's no special ed in college, right? So when they graduate high school and they leave this world of special education entitlements and services, your student is leaving that world and heading into sort of the ADA world, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the world of 504 and accommodations. So when they are in a dual enrollment program, and they're at their home high school, they're going to have access to their normal special ed services. But when they go to the college and take that course, they're only going to have access to the things that the other typically matriculating students have access to, which is the student support office. It's sometimes referred to as the ADA office, or most colleges have kind of their own unique name for that office. But we want our students prior to high school graduation, and especially if they are college bound, we want them to learn how that system works. What does it feel like? What does it look like? How do you ask for help? It's a place where the student can be learning self-advocacy skills. and working with that student support office. Let's say they need some support on that dual enrollment course. They would go talk with the student support office at that college, and they would get access to services or supports that they offer for all college students. And it's going to look different than special ed. So that's one of the reasons why it's a great activity, because it lets students experience this within the safety and confines of still being in high school and still having all those services back at their home high school. For college-bound students, the student and the family has plans to visit the student support office at the college. For college-bound students, a plan is in place to get evaluations. We sort of touched on this a little earlier, and the summary of performance to the student support office at the college with legal guardian permission. And like I said, most of the colleges will ask for that. They want the most recent evaluations. They want the SOP, the summary performance. The nice thing I've seen over the years with the student support offices at the colleges, a lot of times the folks that work there have a disability background or maybe used to be a special educator, and have some good experience around this. So, um, we want our students to be, if they are going to go on to college, we want them to be ready and have developed some skills in figuring out how to get some supports and some help and becoming a little more independent, right? Um,
Okay, so John, there is just a comment here. Can I add that the same applies to developmental services in terms of the leaving entitlement? Services provided in high school, like speech, OT, and PT, occupational and physical therapy, etc., are not guaranteed in adult services.
yes, exactly. That's correct. And we are gonna, that's a, when we get down to the one of the next one of the last components, that's a big area we're going to spend more time focusing on, is this transition to adult services. And we're going to go look at this recommended timeline that our developmental services partners have created. But yes, that is everything you just said. I totally agree with, totally true. And it's just something to remember, in that, when the students in high school, they have all these entitlements, and then when they graduate, it's a whole different world. So it's in terms of developmental services, it's going to be related to their eligibility, right? Um, and we want to help our students and our families be ready for all of that. And so that is part of the underlying intent as well of this tool. So that teams can be thinking ahead of time. You don't want to have to deal with this or sort of think through this at the last minute, right? Like you want years ahead of time thinking through this. This is complicated. These things are coming down the pipeline. What are we doing to be ready for this? What skills does a student need to be we need to be working on to have a better outcome when they graduate? But it's a good point to bring up. All right. For students that can benefit from assistive technology, they've had a chance to try out appropriate devices that may be able to help them in their post-school life. And more information can be found at the Assistive Technology Program website. So if this is an area, again, access has, if the nature of the student's disability is such that it's something that assistive technology might be able to help with, and if they haven't had a chance to try that out or access it, that's an item. That is something to be problem solving as a team. What are we going to do to address this? And like I said, the link is right there. I would go work with those folks, pull them in, try to get a handle on what devices might be appropriate to try out. Um, Now, if the family is connected with higher ability, and you have a transition counselor involved, that's what we want. It's an awesome person to have involved. That person can also help you navigate and find the appropriate people to connect with for assistive technology. And just a quick note on hireability. I review lots and lots of transition plans statewide, right? And I see a fair number of plans where the parents say they don't give consent to invite hireability. And I just want to address this for a second. Now, I totally respect that and understand why you might not want that. But what I'm going to say is if your student has made a connection with hireability, okay, and they're connected, when your student graduates, they have somebody in their corner that is connected to all these different human services, and that person can help get them connected to what it is they need to be connected with. So if they don't have that, and let's say they're not eligible for developmental services and they don't have connection to hireability, when they graduate, they don't really have anybody in their corner that is already set up. And that can cause new challenges for parents. So I'm always encouraging parents to make that connection with hireability. You're going to have them in your corner. And of course, you might have VFN in your corner, no matter what. But I just mean like having that formal connection with hireability, they can help your son or daughter get connected to different kinds of services and activities and things after graduation. All right. A lot of these are things that we added into the tool. Like if you Google the Vermont Graduation Readiness tool, you might find the old tool just because it's the way the internet is. But just make sure at the top it says December of 2024. And it should say it also at the bottom. Yeah, December of 2024. So this is another one that we added because it's just really important to know. And it's almost like the access points might not be relevant here for this particular one, but the IEP team and everybody on this call should know that the early college program, which is an initiative that kind of came out with like the flexible pathways legislation, where it called for dual enrollment, increased access to career and technical education and early college. So if a student does early college, they have to unenroll from their high school. And if you unenroll from your high school, you lose special ed services. So I don't think most folks here want that. And so I just want to make sure people realize this, that typically for students on IEPs, early college might not be a good fit. Whereas dual enrollment might be a much better fit because they don't have to unenroll from high school, still have all the access to their supports and services, and then they can go experience this course at the college. Early college is unenrolling from high school and going to college full time. That's what it is. And the college can set up a 504 plan. Those are building specific. It wouldn't be the home high school to set that up. It would be the new where they're going to college. So word of warning on that one, I generally don't recommend early college unless it's something the IEP team has totally vetted this and thinks it's appropriate. Of course, I would defer to the IEP team on that. All right.
So, John, I'm just going to do a quick time check. It's 1:45. So
okay.
Just
I'm going to pick up the pace a little here. If appropriate, as determined by transition assessments, the student has received training around independent living. And that would come back to that independent living annual goal. What's the underlying skill they need? And then what are the transition services that are going to support that student in meeting that goal? Relevant outside agencies like developmental services or hireability were included in the transition planning. Next up, supported decision-making has been considered, and there is a guidance document here that's really designed for educators. And there is more information on this for parents, and I believe VF Vermont Family Network can help you get more information on that if you're interested. And it's really a family specific, individually specific decision, whereas for some young adults it might totally make sense, and for some others it might not. It's really up to the family And it would, real quick, it basically, like if a family wanted to do this, it would mean when your son or daughter turns 18, they would remain their own guardian, and they would have this very specific sort of arrangement set up so that they have the right folks to help them make decisions about things like finances, independent living, employment, and you build the structure around them so that they have support in making those decisions. Does the student have a medical coordinator or a medical home? If um, and if so, has the student's medical home coordinator been invited to the transition planning meetings? That's another area of important collaboration before the student graduates. All right, this is a big one. This is the last item, but it's probably one of the most important aspects of this whole entire thing. And it's really about the handoff, or sort of the transition to adult services. Um, and this is a big one. Students are in their final year of high school. Um, the parents need to know that um, you have to be able to release educational records to the Developmental Services Agency or the Specialized Services Agency so that they can prepare for the future graduate coming to get services from them. And there really should be a clear plan for this transition. Now, I'm going to click on this resource. So this is some guidance that our developmental services partners, as well as Hireability was involved with this as well, made some guidance. So I'm going to just kind of skim through this. There's some, key bullets on here. But I want to get down. There's a little bit of a timeline here on some suggested activities. So you have freshman year suggested team activities. You have 10th grade suggested team activities and some guiding questions for the IEP team. 11th grade. So this is all stuff that hopefully, if the IEP team is starting those graduation readiness tool work at 9th grade, you can really be forecasting and looking at these other items as the student is getting closer and closer to graduation. What are the things we need to be thinking about as a team prior to the student transitioning to adult services? So there's suggested team activities with guiding questions, and it goes all the way through the extended high school years potentially. So, if the team is using the readiness tool and determines that the student needs more time, so if they're not going to graduate with their peers and they're going to come back for another year or two, depending on what you've decided based on what you're seeing with the tool, how much access has the student had for these things? Do we need more time for the student to get access? And that's why we would be extending the time for, as an IEP team, we would make the decision to extend the time. Now, if it's a situation where the ultimate sort of thing where the LEA, the high school might say, okay, we've gone through the readiness tool. We want to have the student graduate on this date. And if as a parent you don't agree with that or you have a problem with that, you can click this link, and there is a process for mediation that the Vermont AOE can facilitate and would use a objective person. It's not tied to AOE or the school to mediate. And a mediated agreement is always a good first option to problem solve this type of scenario. So let's just see. I can try to address other questions if that haven't been addressed. So let's see. I'm going to try to pull up the chat here. All right. Is there
Okay,
anything?
so go ahead and please put questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask John. But
Yeah.
I'd like to give folks maybe like half a minute to click on the survey link and perhaps work a little on the survey. So we will be quiet for about half a minute. But also feel free to put questions in the chat.
I have a question. I didn't put it in the chat, but in terms of just marking access points and student engagement, like if you're working with a student with chronic absenteeism and you're lining up appointments with higher ability and having, could you just score that like you're consistently, at a 2 for that column, and then if the student isn't showing up, that would be a 0, like just to document like everything you're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, that would be like the student engagement part would probably be a 0, right? If they're not engaged and they're not coming to school, and
Yeah.
it would signify to the team, well, what are some strategies and things we can do to try to problem solve this? But generally on the school side, typically they always want to try to document what services they're providing. But yeah, I mean, the tool is really designed to help you as a team see what areas do we really need to focus on. And if student engagement and absenteeism is the main problem for that student, well, what can we problem solve there as a team at our school? And
Okay.
yeah.
And John, there's a comment. The tool seems to be more of an assessment of the school and IEP team than it is of the student.
Well, yes, because it's about the access. That tool is trying to determine, has the student had access to these things? Because that's the information you need to determine the graduation date, especially if the student has complex needs and disabilities.
So did you? Okay,
Sure.
that's another. Okay.
One of the problems we run into is that the student turns 18 and has educational rights and can refuse the transition supports. They argue that they have met the academic requirements and that they should graduate. So, yeah, that can be a challenge, right? Like the student's their own guardian. They just want to get out. They're done. Um, that's a tough one. I don't have that's one of those problem solving type like discussion items like as a team. Like, well, what can we do to hook our student back in terms of you know, services and supports. And again, I would bring it back to their interests. This is why we do transition assessments, right? Like we're trying to tap into the students' interests, their needs, their strengths, their preferences, as those things relate to their future, whether it's related to employment or education and training. Is there a cool work-based learning thing that can be set up for that student and hook them back in? Is there a CTE program maybe that they want to get some hands-on access to if they have the skills to get into CTE? Yeah, it's a tough one though. I see another comment here. I use this tool to inform my practice, and this new upgrade is really great. Intensive needs special educator in facilitating team meetings and being transparent about where we're going and why. That's awesome to hear, Brett. And that's really that's the intent of why we created this. It's really to try to quantify the access that the student has had to these supports and services related to transition.
Yep. So that's another couple of questions, John. You can read them, or I can read them.
Would it be fair? Oh, sorry, let me back up.
There's someone above it.
Yeah.
Can the student walk?
Can the student walk with their peers for the ceremony but not receive a diploma and stay an extra year for transition? Yes, they can. And we do have guidance on the AOE website for that. They can participate in the graduation ceremony and not officially graduate. It's typically just once though. So they would participate in that ceremony once and then they'd come back for another year or two. That's again up to the team and based on all the information. Okay. I'm going to get to this next one. Would it be fair to think that early intervention, i.e. starting in 9th grade, would help mitigate some of the get me out response? If they know their path early, they might buy in earlier. I would say probably yes, Jess. I think there's a number of potentially positive benefits to starting this earlier, and continue sort of fostering that engagement and keeping them hooked in. And again, it probably comes back to making sure the IEP team is doing good transition assessments and tapping into those interests and preferences. All right, how does Voc Rehab fit in here? Well, we want them connected so that when the student graduates, they have them in their corner. Voc Rehab can help in a number of different ways. They can all help with some of the transition assessment process. They can help the family navigate things in the human services world in Vermont. There's a number of benefits. They're an additional asset to transition, really. Next up, I'd like to get documentation to share with my principal. Okay, Janet, what documentation do you mean?
It's the walk with your
Oh,
class.
let me,
Yeah.
I'm gonna just, I have a guidance document real quick. If I got 2 minutes, right? I can
Yes,
hopefully
you do
pull
have
this
2
up.
minutes.
If there's another question I can answer while I'm finding this.
It looks as if Christine put that link in, so you do not have to dig
Oh,
it.
she already did? She found it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, good. Oh, wait. Well, that is not the AOE website. I'm going to pull up the one I had in mind, and maybe then there'll be 2 options to check
Yeah,
for.
it's right. It's under here too, where if you scroll down a little, it tells you about the same thing.
Okay. Well,
About staying
participate.
enrolled even though they have participated in the graduation ceremony. So
Okay. I just put it in again too with this other link. All right. What
okay.
other questions do people have before we go? Okay, there's one more. Oh, I think that was just.
Nope, I think that's just reminding everyone that we do like surveys to be completed when you attend our workshops, and you will get that survey link too in the email that we will send after, that will have a link to the recording as well as the information, the PowerPoint that was shared. So, yep, we are at 2:00. John, you got through everything. So thank you, John, for sharing this great information. And we have, for everyone else, we have many more interesting workshops coming up, and you can find details about those on the homepage of our website, along with links to previously recorded ones. And this will go on our website when it's ready to go. We have tons of information on our website. Getting connected with us is easy. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram. We also have closed Facebook pages for parents of children with disabilities, also one for parents of adult children. You can sign up for monthly e-news. You can check out our YouTube channel where all of these recordings are. And we're here to help, and contact us on phone, through the phone or email. And thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.